You're watching Washington at Work. I'm Diana Longrie. Thank you for tuning in. Washington at Work is brought to you from the SCC studios out of White Bear Lake. Washington at Work looks at issues of national importance, primarily peace, justice, and jobs. Today, we're going to be looking at an issue that's very important for members of Congress to be very aware of, especially when they are creating public policy and creating legislation that has an impact on citizens and the future of our democracy. We're going to be looking at media and looking at the commercial media and exactly how they're interconnected and how they are funded and what exactly are their biases. Now, we have found a very informative program that was on Link TV, and so for those of you who would maybe like to see this program in its entirety, Link TV is where you should go to find the complete program, of which we're going to be showing excerpts from today. They're talking about the media and the impact that it has on our society.
Has led instead to a shriveling and a dilapidation of our democracy. Well, media ownership is, on one level, seems entirely unimportant because Rupert Murdoch and Sumner Redstone, the owners of our media company, Michael Eisner, the CEO, don't write the movies, they don't play the music, they don't act in their shows. So they seem like just people who count the money in the background. But that's a very misleading and deceptive way to understand how power works in media. The whole logic of a corporate enterprise flows from the top. The point is to make as much money as possible. And if you don't start there, you can never understand how these institutions work and what effect they have. The U.S. media system is basically broken down into three tiers of corporations. The first tier are the huge giants. These include Viacom, AOL Time Warner, Disney, News Corporation, Sony, Vivendi. The next tier of companies is one notch down. These are the companies like Comcast or General Electric, the major newspaper giant chains like the New York Times, Knight Ridder, Tribune Company would be in that second tier. This third tier is, though, hundreds of thousands of very small companies that sort of round out the system and do the stuff that the big guys don't find profitable, that fill some local niche. But if you look at the numbers, you say, well, there are hundreds of thousands of media companies, but that's misleading. There's really only a couple dozen that dominate the system. And in all likelihood, that number is going to continue to shrink because as we do this interview, the Federal Communications Commission is in the process of revisiting the few remaining media regulations that prevent these firms from merging newspaper companies with television companies, cable companies with newspaper companies. Once those restrictions are lifted, and there's tremendous pressure by powerful lobbies to do so, we should anticipate a massive wave of consolidation, and those 24 firms will probably shrink down to 18 or 20.
On this program, Washington at Work, one of the issues that we have discussed is the issue of net neutrality, and there really has been a lot of discussion about that on Capitol Hill, about whether or not that companies like Comcast or other cable companies would be able to segregate various different tiers of usage at different costs. And based upon that may have an impact on the amount of speed that you would have or the amount of access that you might ultimately end up with. And many people are supportive of net neutrality. The regular folks like you and I are supportive of net neutrality because it creates a level playing field for all of us. It doesn't matter whether or not if you are a large corporation or whether or not you are a small business owner who's just trying to get your foot in the door, or the regular Joe on Main Street, USA, who is just out there trying to use the internet. When they're looking at net neutrality, there is a great pressure by many of the large corporations to allow them to indeed have a structured system. So let's continue on and hear some more about the interaction of all these different media sources and why they do indeed have an interest in maintaining the power and the structure that they have today.
The Federal Communications Commission has released a series of studies as part of its review of media ownership rules. Many observers are anticipating that ownership rules will be relaxed early next year, leading to further consolidation.
One of the striking features, though, that explains media concentration is the rise of what we call media conglomeration, where media companies like AOL Time Warner have put together these far-flung empires with book divisions, with merchandising, with music divisions, with sports teams, in addition to film studios, magazines, and television interests. There are 4 reasons why conglomeration or synergy have made so much sense for media companies, and why all of them have really gone that direction in earnest in the past decade. The first is that it allows tremendous advantages in what's called cross-promotion. So Viacom's Paramount Pictures releases a movie, for example. It can promote that movie incessantly on MTV, its cable channel, or VH1. It can promote it at Blockbuster Video Rental, which it owns. It can promote it on Entertainment Tonight, a television show it produces.
Star Trek Nemesis explodes into theaters December 13th, but you can...
The second factor is cross-production. So if you make something that's a successful movie, you can then turn it into a TV show, into a cable show, into a book, into a soundtrack, and make all the related profits for that. Third, and this is very important, it gives you a lot more leverage over advertisers. So a company like Viacom or Disney can go to a major advertiser like Procter & Gamble or Pepsi and make them $1 billion deal across all their different media to get all this business from them. And they do that, which basically means the smaller companies have no hope of competing. And then fourth and finally is a crucial thing, that media tend to be relied on blockbusters. That's the nature of these markets. There's a tremendous amount of risk. You spend a lot on a TV show, on a movie, but it might be a complete bomb. You might lose everything. At the same time, one blockbuster can carry an entire film studio for a whole year and cover up all the losses and still make profits. What this means is there's tremendous pressure to get bigger and bigger so you have less risk.
So you can see the importance of being able to retain the market share, the power, the control of all the different media sources that one might use to promote your product, to promote your message, and that certainly through these synergies they can do that. Now, as you heard, the larger you are, the more leverage you have, and that the smaller companies basically have no chance of competing with the big boys. Now, why is that important, and why should members of Congress know the way that this works? Well, Congress has the ability of being able to create the public policy that either further encourages and promotes this power structure, or they have the ability to be able to create legislation and public policy that encourages a more level playing field, so that way small businesses are able to compete as well. And you heard that there's this movement to try to relax the regulations with regard to media ownership, and that will ultimately result then in further and further consolidation, so that in the end you'll only have a couple of 1 or 2 players in the whole entire media field controlling the message, controlling the money, and ultimately controlling the access to be able to get a message out. This is important, I believe, for us to be aware of this, and for our members of Congress to understand the implication of this scenario. Public access TV, a product of what this program is broadcast on, public access TV is grounded in the First Amendment right. And public access TV is a way that citizens can come out and be able to talk about issues that are important to them, issues that maybe the commercial media may not want to discuss. But what about the other smaller commercial media out there that would like to compete with the big boys with regard to either content, message, or being able to have advertisers? Because again, advertisers want to go where there's the media that's got the highest impact. And that, of course, would be the big boys in the commercial media, not necessarily the smaller media outlets. And so the smaller media outlets end up having fewer and fewer advertisers that want to advertise their products, their service, their message on those smaller media outlets because they don't have as large a reach. So let's continue on. Again, this film footage is our excerpts from a program that was on Link TV.
People often ask, well, why is it that these media companies got so huge in the past decade? I mean, why not 50 years ago if it's such a great idea? And the reasons for this are partially deregulation by the government, which made it possible for companies to merge in ways that were illegal before, partially new technologies that made it more feasible to merge different media sectors together, and partially just the logical pressure of capitalism. I mean, one of the myths of capitalism, and I suspect most people have heard this, that it's based on competition. Actually, it's not based on competition, it's based on smashing competition. And for smart companies, the less direct competition you have, the better. And in capitalism, that means it's very smart to get big as possible, because that means there's less chance that you're going to face competition coming at you.
When I was in Washington, D.C. this past March in 2011, I had the opportunity of being able to listen to one of the hearings where they talked about net neutrality. And they were discussing certain amendments that they wanted to propose. And it was interesting in that some of the dialogue of what they're, because the committee was controlled by the Republicans, and the Democrats on this committee, they had information that they were discussing, which they said had been previously talked about in this committee in the past when it was controlled by the Democrats. And at that time, this amendment and the basis content of this amendment had been supported by the Republicans of the committee. And the debate that was going on in the committee at the time when I was there in March of 2011 is that the Democrats were saying, well, when the Republicans were in the minority, they supported this amendment in order to be able to provide that the FCC has control over looking at this issue of net neutrality and having the ability of being able to make rules with regard to that. And that now, today, that the Republicans, the same Republicans, were no longer in support of that amendment and allowing the FCC to have that ability to make rules with regard to net neutrality. And I found it ironic that in just having a short period of time of a year or two, that this would flip-flop like this, something that had been had the support of members of both parties now today appeared as if it didn't. So I didn't know if it's because this issue has changed, if the facts have changed, or is it simply because money is more at stake than it was before. Let's continue on with our film footage.
One of the myths of our media system is that it's sort of this natural private system that was born by heroic entrepreneurs, and the government's job is only to come in and meddle with it and interfere with the entrepreneurs in the private sector. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, our media system is the direct result of government policies that created it. The Federal Communications Commission was established in 1934, and on paper its function is to represent the public's interests with regard to the allocation of licenses to broadcasters. So the deal is, in theory, that we're giving the people of this country are giving monopoly licenses to private commercial companies to use very scarce, valuable channels in each community. And in exchange, these companies should do something they wouldn't do if they were simply private concerns out to maximize profit. They should do something in the public interest. And it's the FCC's job to see that they do that. Now that's what we're taught in Mrs. McGillicuddy's civics class is what it's supposed to do. Nothing could be further from the truth. The way it has evolved over time is the FCC has proven to be almost entirely powerless to force any sort of serious public interest requirements on commercial media. And in fact, the corruption of the process would be difficult to exaggerate. One way to think about how media policy making is done in the United States is to consider the Oscar-winning film from 1974, The Godfather Part 2. Early in that film, there's a scene where Hyman Roth and Michael Corleone are sitting on top of a rooftop at a Havana hotel with a bunch of American gangsters. And they're carving up a cake that has an outline of Cuba on it. They all agree it's their cake and no one else should get a piece of it. And they're fighting over who gets the largest piece. Well, that's how media policy making is done in the United States.
What I'm saying is that we have now what we have always needed, real partnership with the government.
Carving up the cake. They all agree that they're going to have a piece of it, but they're not going to give a piece to anyone else. Brought to my mind the importance of being able to preserve a level playing field when it comes to the internet and having net neutrality, and when it comes to preserving the ability of citizens to be able to have free access to public access TV. These are two of the tools that citizens have to be able to communicate their ideas, exercising their freedom of speech, and certainly for small business owners who are looking to compete in a world economy, being able to have access to the internet at the same level playing field as any large corporation is so important to them to be able to have their ability to be able to compete with the big boys. And as you heard earlier, competition is competition. What is competition? What is a free enterprise? Well, in some circles, as you heard, it's to squash the competition, and whoever is the biggest creates the most market share and can push everybody else out. That's what their idea is. And I think a lot of folks, when they're thinking about it from a regular person's perspective, they're thinking competition is the ability of this business and that business to compete on a level playing field with each other, so that way they can market their services, their product, on not only on price, but also on the quality of the service they provide for those extra added value services. And if you limit the airwaves, if you limit the amount of access that individuals and small business owners have to the internet, to the airwaves, well then indeed now you have created a public policy that is favoring one group of entities over another. And that's why I think it is very important that indeed members of Congress are very aware of how this works and the interactions, and that we should have members of Congress who are in Congress who understand exactly how this works, and that they're not afraid to speak up for the small business owners, for the individuals, for citizens, to make sure and maintain that we have net neutrality, that we have a level playing field when it comes to the internet, and that indeed that we keep the airwaves of public access TV open and available for citizens of all communities. So let's continue on. Again, this is film footage from a program that is on Link TV.
The Telecommunication Act of 1996 is arguably one of the 3 or 4 most important laws of the last 50 years.
Good evening and welcome to the revolution. We begin tonight with all of the changes about to take place in the life of anyone who uses a phone or a television or a computer.
It began today when President Clinton signed the bill that will revolutionize the industry. There are big changes coming in the way that we'll get television, telephone, and computer services.
This was Congress's sort of charter for how it should see communication develop in the digital age, with the internet, with the changes in radio and television, that this was laying out the fundamental values that should guide the FCC for the next 2 or 3 generations of the information age. A law of this magnitude, you would hope, would be the subject of political debate, of candidates discussing it, public involvement, of extensive press coverage, since the values it would embody would be so crucial to the future of our nation. The promise of the law when it was passed, the rhetoric, and why all the politicians voted for it, was that by deregulating ownership restrictions on media companies and telecommunication companies, it would lead to a whole new wave of competition, which would lead to lower prices and higher quality service. And we'd no longer need government regulation on behalf of the public interest. The market would regulate better.
The big players in the system that has the ability to undercut with regard to price alone, undercut to squelch any competition so that there is no competition and that the small market providers basically cannot compete with the very large, massive mega communications companies, and that in part is the issue. Congress truly does have the power and the authority to give the FCC the authority they need to make sure that there is indeed a level playing field for communications companies who are operating in the United States. Let's continue on.
Inaccurate. It's a misnomer. There's no such thing as deregulation. What we really mean by deregulation is simply regulation on behalf of private interests with no pretense of regulating on behalf of the public. That's what deregulation means. And when you hear the term deregulation, you should substitute that. Deregulation means regulation purely on behalf of private parties, not on behalf of the public.
We will help to create an open marketplace where competition and innovation can move as quick as light.
There were two industries in the bill that were explicitly deregulated immediately, one of which were the telephone companies. In 1996, we had 11 or 12 major telephone companies in the United States, the 7 Baby Bell, Sprint, MCI, WorldCom, and AT&T, and GT&E. Today we're down to about 7, and by all accounts we might be down to 3 or 4 companies within a few years. What that means is we'll go from a situation where we used to have just a handful of companies that were regulated to have a smaller number of companies with even less regulation in the public interest, more private power. A disaster for us, great for these telephone companies. Radio is the other industry that was explicitly deregulated. Thanks again to a very powerful radio station owning lobby, a clause was put in that completely changed the ownership restrictions on radio stations in the United States. The limit before 1996 still was only 40 stations nationally that a single company could own, or up to 4 in a single community. The 1996 law erased the national limit altogether. A company could own as many stations as it wanted, and it could own up to 8 in the largest communities. Since 1996, something like 2/3 of all American radio stations have been sold, and the industry has been completely made over. There are a handful of giants now that own most of the radio stations in the country.
When you have such consolidation, I believe what it does, it puts the airwaves in the hands of a few powerful corporations, a few powerful individuals who then ultimately have the ability to control not only the airwaves, but the ability to control the message. If they have the airwaves, they have the power, they have the control, why would they want to create a level playing field so that others could come in, other voices, other people and companies or entities who want to provide a different message? I think it's important that we do what we need to do at Capitol Hill to keep the airwaves open, to keep net neutrality, to indeed have regulation in a way that maintains open airwaves and the ability for the small business owners, the small companies, the small media communications companies to be able to compete with those larger corporations. Because ultimately, I think our democracy is very dependent upon that. If you, in the end, have only one corporation, one entity who controls the airwaves, who controls the message, it will be very hard for any other voice to be heard, and ultimately democracy depends on more than one voice. It depends on many voices having dialogue, communication of ideas and of thoughts, and if the airwaves are controlled by a limited few, a limited amount of communications and thoughts and dialogue will ever emerge.
Is that radio has gone from being our most democratic medium, our most decentralized, our most creative medium, to being our most regimented, standardized, least interesting medium in the country, hyper-commercialized.
94.7 FM plays the best songs on the radio.
95.7.
And you won't find a single listener in this country who's satisfied with radio. But the people's interests have nothing to do with how those policies are made. They're made behind closed doors by powerful lobbies, and they're unalterable.
There you go. The public policies are created behind closed doors by powerful lobbyists, not in the interests of the public. That's where Congress comes in. Congress can act in the best interests of the public, and they should act in the best interests of the public. That's what they're elected to do. It's very important that our members of Congress are aware of the impact that will be felt if indeed we do not maintain net neutrality in the United States when it comes to the internet. Certainly, it's important for the development of small businesses to be able to compete within the global community, to be able to promote their products, their services by use of the internet. And if indeed we do not maintain net neutrality and the big corporations who control the internet are allowed to create a tiered system whereby they can charge different amounts for different access or different speeds for the companies, that indeed what happens then is that will limit that small business owner's ability to be able to compete with the big businesses. And again, there have been times where there's been bills that have been brought forward to limit the public access throughout the United States so that citizens like you and me can have public access TV programs such as this and other programs that you may be watching on a regular basis. Public access TV is a way to be able to express a person's First Amendment right to be able to talk about issues that the commercial media doesn't cover, or to talk about different viewpoints, different ideas that perhaps the mainstream commercial media also does not want to promote. It's a way to be able to communicate with other citizens. We're getting down to the end of our program, and I'd like to hear from you as to how you feel about this. How do you feel about the commercial media? We're going to be putting up our number on the screen so that you can call our hotline to give your viewpoint on this topic. And what do you think Congress should be looking at when it comes to keeping the net neutral so that all have the same and equal access? Let's continue on.
To have a democratic society, you need to have a vibrant, healthy journalism. It's axiomatic. It's the cornerstone of democratic theory. And what you need from that journalism is a feisty, rigorous accounting of people in power and people who want to be in power. They have to be held accountable so people know what they're doing. You need to have a wide range of opinions on the important issues of the day so people can formulate their own opinions. And you need to have a way to get the truth to come out. So there's some way to check for lies and to get factual accuracy to emerge.
Congress has it in their power to ensure that citizens are entitled to freedom of speech. Who is to hear you if you have no method by which you can communicate to others? Thank you very much for tuning in. We'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.